During a routine morning patrol, an officer halted a speeding car that wasn't equipped with any emergency lights or sirens. Anticipating a standard traffic violation, he was instead confronted by a nurse in panic, racing to get an unconscious patient to the hospital. As the emergency blanket slipped slightly, revealing a hint of dark, curly hair, time froze. The critically ill child in the passenger seat was his own son, who was supposed to be at school. In that moment, his life shattered, and the harrowing truth about how his son landed in that situation would soon unfold a father's deepest fears. Stay with us to the end to discover the unfolding of this tale, a story you cannot afford to miss. The morning sun bathed the Reed family's kitchen, warming the breakfast table. Dressed in his crisp police uniform, Malcolm Reed stood at the counter, sipping his coffee while observing his son, Jason, who was 10, absent-mindedly pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. Martha Reed, Malcolm's wife, moved through the kitchen gracefully, her voice tinged with concern as she noted Jason's unusual quietness. "Jason, sweetheart, you need to eat. You've got a long day ahead at school." Jason responded with a quiet murmur, his gaze fixed on his plate. Noticing they were getting behind schedule, Malcolm was about to prompt Jason to hurry when he saw his son's shoulders droop and his eyes cast downward. Clearly, something was amiss. "Jason," Malcolm said, his voice softening, "what's the matter? Are you not feeling well?" Shaking his head, Jason avoided his father's eyes. "I don't want to go to school," he whispered. Exchanging a concerned glance with Martha, Malcolm knelt by Jason's chair to meet his gaze. "Is it the bullies again? Are Elam and Edric still bothering you?" With tears starting to form, Jason nodded. Malcolm's heart sank with a mix of anger and protectiveness. He had hoped the school's enhanced anti-bullying efforts would have curbed these issues, yet the torment for his son continued. "Let me look," Malcolm urged gently, scanning Jason for signs of physical bullying. That's when he noticed Jason's feet under the table, the toenails blackened and peeling, an obvious sign of recent harm. "Jason, what happened to your feet?" Jason's voice trembled as he shared the ordeal. "Elam and Edric made me run barefoot on the pavement a few days back. They said that kids with my skin color usually don't wear shoes, so I shouldn't need them either." Hearing the racist taunts thrown at his son filled Malcolm with an intense rage. Despite the inner turmoil, he maintained his composure for the sake of Jason. Malcolm inhaled deeply, his mind flooded with thoughts on how to address the situation. As a police officer, he had encountered numerous bullying incidents, yet dealing with his own son's predicament, he struggled to detach his professional duties from his fatherly feelings. "Jason," Malcolm started, his tone echoing the authority of both a father and a law enforcement officer, "you need to stand up for yourself. Remember the self-defense techniques I taught you? Use them if they try to harm you again." Martha, overhearing the conversation, chimed in gently, "Malcolm, he's only 10. Malcolm raised his hand, cutting off her concerns. "At 10, he needs to learn resilience, Martha. We can't shield him forever." Jason's eyes widened with a blend of fear and uncertainty. "But Dad, what if I get in trouble for fighting back?" Malcolm responded firmly, "You won't be in trouble for defending yourself, son. It's crucial you show those bullies you're not an easy target. That's the only way they'll back off." Jason hesitated, then asked timidly, "Could I, maybe, have some pepper spray or a mini taser?" Malcolm's expression stiffened. "No, Jason. Those could land you in serious trouble at school. You need to demonstrate courage through physical means first. Use the techniques I've taught you." Martha observed the conversation with increasing concern, her maternal instincts conflicting with Malcolm's stern approach. As Jason stood up reluctantly to leave, she attempted once more to persuade him to eat. "Jason, please, just one more bite before you go." Malcolm, however, was already guiding Jason towards the door. Stop coddling him, Martha. He's 10. If he's hungry, he can eat at the school cafeteria later. We're running late. As Jason made his way to the car, Martha confronted Malcolm quietly yet urgently. Malcolm, isn't this a bit harsh? He's still a child. Malcolm's jaw clenched, resolute. This is the only way he'll learn, Martha. Life isn't all sunshine and rainbows. We need to prepare him for the real world. But pushing him to fight? There has to be another way, Martha pleaded. Malcolm's tone softened, but his determination was unwavering. Sometimes, people only grow strong when they're pushed to the brink. We can't shield him forever, Martha. He needs to learn to fend for himself. With that, he gave Martha a quick peck on the cheek and headed to the car where Jason was waiting. As Malcolm settled into the driver's seat, he noticed the apprehension and conflict on Jason's face. For a moment, doubt crept in about his approach, but he quickly dismissed it, convincing himself it was for Jason's benefit. This was the only way to ensure his son grew up resilient and capable in an unforgiving world. They drove off, the morning sun reflecting off the polished surface of Malcolm's cruiser, a symbol of authority that now cast a long shadow over the father and son. The patrol car moved smoothly through the quiet morning streets, enveloped in a palpable silence. Jason sat, his body slightly turned away from Malcolm, his gaze fixed outside. Malcolm clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with his conflicting roles. Trained to manage tough situations with composed authority, as a father, he found himself struggling to find the right words. He wished to offer reassurance, to bridge the growing gap between them, but words failed him each time he tried to speak. Malcolm's mind replayed the morning's conversation, questioning whether his approach was too severe, whether he should have chosen a different path. His training underscored the importance of strength and independence, especially crucial for a young black boy in their community. Yet, Malcolm's fatherly instincts whispered that maybe Jason needed something more, understanding, comfort, or simply a listening ear. As they came to a stop at a red light, Malcolm took the moment to glance at his son. The reflection of Jason's face in the window, etched with worry and bearing burdens no child should, clenched Malcolm's heart. He almost reached out to pat Jason's shoulder, to offer a gesture of comfort, but the light turned green, and the moment slipped away. As they approached the school, Malcolm broke the tense silence. "Remember, son," his voice came out gruffer than intended, "use those defense tactics if you need to. Don't let them push you around." Jason nodded silently, his gaze still locked on the world outside the car. They arrived at the school parking lot, and as the car halted near the main entrance, Jason unbuckled his seat belt and reached for his backpack, his movements slow and hesitant. As he opened the door to step out, Malcolm felt compelled to say something more, to somehow make things right. "Jason," he called out, making the boy pause and look back. Malcolm rolled down the window and leaned toward his son. "Remember what I taught you. You're strong, son. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jason nodded again, a flicker of something. Was it determination or resignation? Crossing his face. "Okay, Dad," he said softly before turning and walking toward the school entrance. Malcolm watched his son's retreating figure, noticing the slump in his shoulders and the drag in his steps, painting a picture more of resignation than the confidence Malcolm had hoped to instill. For a moment, he debated getting out of the car and marching into the principal's office to demand action against the bullies. But then he remembered his own words about self-reliance and standing up for oneself. With a heavy sigh, Malcolm put the car in drive, lingering in the parking lot a few more minutes as he watched Jason disappear into the school building. The father in him wanted to rush in, to shield his child from the cruelties of the world, but the police officer within insisted this was a necessary lesson, a crucial step in Jason's growth. Finally, with one last look at the school, Malcolm drove away, the gnawing feeling in his gut growing with each passing mile. He tried to convince himself he had made the right decision, that Jason needed to learn these hard lessons, but as he headed toward the police station, a nagging doubt persisted, whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a terrible mistake. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the town as Malcolm's patrol car disappeared around a corner, leaving behind a school where unseen dangers lurked and a young boy faced his fears alone. Malcolm's patrol car cruised slowly down Main Street, the mid-morning sun glinting off its polished surface. He had been on duty for a couple of hours now, his mind still preoccupied with thoughts of Jason and their tense morning exchange. The routine nature of checking parking meters and writing tickets provided little distraction from his inner turmoil. As he moved methodically down the street, Malcolm's trained eyes scanned the parked cars for expired meters or parking violations. The mundane task felt at odds with the emotional weight he carried. Each ticket he wrote starkly contrasted with a complex family drama unfolding in his mind. Suddenly, a flash of white caught Malcolm's attention. A Dodge Grand Caravan with a red hospital cross emblazoned on its side sped past him, clearly exceeding the speed limit. Malcolm's police instincts kicked in, pushing his personal concerns to the background. Without hesitation, he slid into the driver's seat of his patrol car, flipped on the siren, and pulled out to pursue the speeding vehicle. The chase was brief. The Med-Ivan, recognizing the police presence, quickly pulled over to the side of the road. Malcolm approached the vehicle cautiously, his hand resting lightly on his holster out of habit as he neared the driver's side window. He saw a blue-uniformed nurse behind the wheel, her face a mixture of panic and professional composure, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "License and registration, please," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years on the force. The nurse fumbled in her purse, producing the requested documents along with her hospital ID. Malcolm noted her name, Nancy Mulligan, as he examined the papers. Nancy spoke, her voice urgent but controlled. "Officer, I know I was speeding, but I have an emergency. There's an unconscious boy in the passenger seat. He needs immediate medical attention." Malcolm's gaze shifted to the passenger seat, where he could see a small figure wrapped in an emergency blanket, an oxygen mask covering most of the child's face. The sight sent a chill down his spine, uncomfortably reminding him of his own son. Despite the obvious urgency of the situation, Malcolm's training compelled him to ask more questions. "Why aren't you using an ambulance? And why is the patient in the front seat?" Nancy's explanation came in a rush of words. "All our ambulances are out on other calls. This is a hospital car, and I had to use it because of how dire the situation is. I secured him in the front seat so I could monitor him for internal bleeding and ensure he was safely restrained. If I lay him at the back, he might choke with blood or vomit, and sudden movement may cause further injuries." Malcolm nodded, processing the information. He glanced again at the unconscious child, a nagging feeling of familiarity tugging at the back of his mind. The emergency blanket shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of dark curly hair that reminded him of Jason, but surely it couldn't be. Pushing the unsettling thought aside, Malcolm focused on the task at hand. He quickly jotted down the vehicle details and Nancy's information. "All right, Miss Mulligan, I understand the emergency, but please be careful. Safety first, even in urgent situations," Malcolm advised. Nancy nodded gratefully. "Thank you, officer. I promise to be more cautious." As Malcolm stepped back from the vehicle, allowing it to pull away, he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. He watched the Med-Ivan speed off, its white form growing smaller in the distance, carrying with it a child whose identity remained a mystery. Malcolm had just resumed his patrol duties, his mind still wrestling with the unsettling encounter with the speeding Med-Ivan. The image of the unconscious child kept flashing in his thoughts, haunting him as he continued his routine checks. But he compelled himself to focus on the immediate task. While checking another row of parked cars, Malcolm's phone rang, displaying the school's number. With a mix of anticipation and dread, he answered. Officer Reed speaking. Mr. Reed, this is Ms. Catherine, Jason's homeroom teacher, came a concerned voice from the other end. I'm calling because Jason hasn't been in class. Not just today, but for the past 3 days. We've been trying to reach you. Malcolm felt the world shift under him as he processed this news. What do you mean? I drove Jason to school myself this morning. I watched him walk into the building. There was a pause on the other line. I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, but Jason hasn't been in class. Are you sure he entered the school? Malcolm's mind raced, replaying the morning's events. He had seen Jason walk towards the school entrance, but had he actually seen him go inside? I need to go, he stammered, ending the call abruptly. Heart pounding, Malcolm jumped into his patrol car and sped toward St. Louis Children's Hospital, the same direction the Medivan had gone. As he drove, he dialed the hospital's number, his fingers trembling. St. Louis Children's Hospital, how may I help you? A receptionist answered. This is Officer Malcolm Reed, he said, his voice tight with urgency. I'm calling about a boy who might have been brought in recently. He's 10 years old, African American, wearing a school uniform. I think he might be my son. There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Yes, we did receive a boy matching that description a short while ago. He was brought in by one of our nurses in a hospital vehicle. Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. Is he okay? What happened? I'm sorry, sir, but I can't disclose medical information over the phone. You'll need to come to the hospital. Malcolm barely heard the rest of the receptionist's words. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and guilt. How could this have happened? How had he not realized something was wrong? As he sped toward the hospital, sirens blaring, Malcolm's phone rang again. It was Bradley Johnson, his superior officer. Officer Malcolm, where are you? Harmony Hills Elementary just called. There's been an incident involving a 10-year-old African-American boy with short curly hair. My mind immediately went to your son. Malcolm cut him off. His voice choked with emotion. Bradley, I think it's Jason. I'm heading to the hospital now. I stopped a speeding Medivan earlier. I think my son was inside, and I didn't even realize it. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. My God, Malcolm, go. Take care of your boy. We'll handle things here. Keep me updated. As Malcolm ended the call, the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. His son, his little boy, was hurt, possibly critically, and he had let it happen. The memory of their argument that morning, his insistence on toughness and self-reliance, now felt like a cruel joke. Tears blurred his vision as he pushed the patrol car to its limits, racing through the streets toward the hospital. The morning's events played on repeat in his mind. Jason's reluctance, the signs of bullying he had dismissed, his own harsh words. How could he have been so blind? As the hospital came into view, Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know what condition he would find Jason in, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The day that had started with a father's misguided attempt to toughen up his son had spiraled into a nightmare, and Malcolm knew that whatever happened next, he would carry the weight of this morning's decisions for the rest of his life. Malcolm's patrol car screeched to a halt in the hospital parking lot, the tires leaving dark marks on the asphalt. He burst out of the vehicle, his police uniform a stark contrast to the panic etched across his face. The automatic doors of the emergency entrance barely had time to slide open before Malcolm rushed through, his shoes squeaking against the floor as he raced to the information desk. "My son," he gasped, his breath coming in short bursts. "Jason Reed. He was brought in recently. Where is he?" The nurse behind the desk, startled by Malcolm's sudden appearance, quickly typed on her computer. "Yes, Jason Reed. He's currently in the ICU. I'll have someone take you there right away." As a young orderly appeared to guide him, Malcolm turned back to the nurse. "Please, can you contact my wife?" "Her name is Martha Reed." He rattled off the phone number, his voice cracking with emotion. "Of course, Officer Reed," the nurse replied, jotting down the number before picking up the phone. The journey to the ICU felt like an eternity, each step bringing Malcolm closer to a reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As they rounded a corner, Malcolm spotted a familiar figure, Nurse Nancy, the woman he had stopped earlier for speeding. She was sitting in a corner, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Malcolm approached her cautiously. "Nurse Mulligan?" Nancy looked up, her eyes widening in recognition and then fear. "Officer Reed, I'm so sorry about the speeding. I didn't realize. Is there a problem? Am I in trouble?" Malcolm held up a hand, silencing her apologies. "My son, Jason. Is he?" Nancy's expression shifted from fear to sorrow. "The boy. He's in there," she said, gesturing to a nearby room. "The doctors are with him now. I'm so sorry, Officer Reed. If I had known it was your son." Malcolm nodded numbly, unable to form words. He moved towards the room, his heart pounding in his ears. Through the window, he could see a small figure on the bed, surrounded by medical equipment. It was Jason, his boy, looking so small and fragile amidst the tubes and wires. A doctor emerged from the room, his face grave. "Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Flores. Your son is in critical condition. We've had to induce a coma due to the severity of his internal injuries." The words hit Malcolm like physical blows. "Internal injuries? What happened?" Dr. Flores explained the situation. Jason had suffered severe internal bleeding, likely from a fall. The full weight of the morning's events crashed down on Malcolm. His son had been lying injured, possibly dying, while he had been writing parking tickets. As the doctor continued to explain Jason's condition, Malcolm's mind raced. The bullies, the school, his own harsh words that morning, all swirled together in a maelstrom of guilt and anger. Nurse Nancy approached hesitantly. "Officer Reed, I want you to know that we did everything we could to get Jason here as quickly as possible. Every second counted." Malcolm turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and anguish. "Thank you," he managed to say. I'm sorry I delayed you." Nancy shook her head. "You were doing your job. I understand." As Malcolm stood there, torn between rushing to his son's bedside and demanding answers about what had happened, he heard a commotion down the hall. Martha had arrived, her face a mask of fear and confusion. "Malcolm," she cried, running towards him. "What happened? Where's Jason?" Malcolm embraced his wife, his composure finally cracking. "Martha, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you this morning. I should have." As Martha peered into Jason's room, her gasp of shock cutting through Malcolm's apologies, the full impact of the day's events settled over them. Their son, their little boy, was fighting for his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, standing in the sterile hospital hallway with the beeping of machines providing a grim soundtrack, Malcolm made a silent vow. He would find out exactly what had happened to Jason, and he would make sure those responsible faced justice. But more than that, he promised himself that if and when Jason recovered, he would be a different father, one who listened more and pushed less, who protected fiercely but also understood deeply. As they prepared to enter Jason's room, Malcolm and Martha clung to each other, drawing strength for the battle ahead. The day had brought devastating revelations, and nothing would ever be the same yet. The ordeal was far from over. The battle for Jason's life was just beginning, and Malcolm was resolute to support his son through every step of the way, making up for the morning's mistakes with all the love and determination he could muster. Time seemed to crawl in the ICU waiting room where Malcolm and Martha sat, their hands clasped tightly, eyes locked on the door to Jason's room. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the incessant beeping of machines hung in the air, a stark reminder of the critical situation. Dr. Flores approached them, her expression composed yet empathetic. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," she started, her voice gentle yet firm, "we are still waiting for the official imaging results, but I wanted to give you an update on Jason's condition." Malcolm and Martha leaned in, their bodies tensed with anticipation. "The immediate concern is Jason's severe blood loss from the fall," Dr. Flores explained. "We've placed him in a coma to stabilize him, but this is only a temporary measure. What Jason urgently needs now is a blood transfusion." Martha's grip on Malcolm's hand tightened. "We can donate, of course," she said promptly. Dr. Flores shook her head slightly. "It's not that simple. Jason has a B blood type. We need to find a compatible donor quickly." Malcolm's heart sank. "I may be A, and Martha is O," he said, the words heavy with realization. The doctor nodded solemnly. "Yes, that rules you both out as donors. We are searching for a suitable match, but time is crucial. The donor needs not only a compatible blood type, but also a history of frequent donations to ensure the blood is safe for immediate use." The gravity of the situation descended on Malcolm and Martha like a heavy blanket. Their son's life was teetering, and they were powerless to provide what he needed most. Martha, her voice shaking but resolute, spoke up. "I'll start calling family and friends right away. Someone must be able to help." Dr. Flores nodded encouragingly. "That's a good start. We're also coordinating with the blood bank, but given Jason's specific needs, finding a match quickly is critical." She paused, her tone turning graver. "I need to inform you, this doesn't appear to be an accident. We've observed scratch marks and bruises across his limbs, as well as blackened toenails, clear signs of physical force. Were you aware of this?" Malcolm and Martha exchanged a somber look before nodding. "We found out this morning," Malcolm said. "Our boy told us he was being bullied by a classmate." "That aligns with what we're seeing," Dr. Flores remarked. "These injuries weren't caused by a simple fall. They're evidence of deliberate aggression." "Thank you, Dr. Flores," Malcolm responded. "I'll inform the police investigation team about this and follow up with the school for confirmation." As the doctor excused herself, promising to return with updates, Malcolm and Martha exchanged looks of shared fear and determination. Martha quickly pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the keypad as she began reaching out to their network of family and friends for a blood donor. Feeling somewhat powerless, Malcolm stepped out of the waiting room to clear his head. In the hallway, he encountered two fellow officers who had responded to the initial call at the school. They approached him, their expressions laden with concern. "Malcolm," one said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, "how's Jason doing?" Malcolm shook his head, his voice rough with emotion. "Not good. He needs a blood transfusion, but finding a match is proving difficult." The officers exchanged glances. Then one spoke up. "Listen, we've got some updates on what happened at the school. Do you want to hear it now, or should we come back later?" Malcolm was torn. Part of him was desperate to know what had transpired, to understand how this nightmare had unfolded. Yet, he knew Jason's immediate medical needs had to take precedence. Later, he decided. Right now, we need to focus on finding a blood donor for Jason. Can you spread the word at the station? Maybe someone there is a match. The officers nodded, promising to help as much as they could before departing. Malcolm leaned against the wall, closing his eyes briefly, the day's events pressing down on him. The guilt from his morning conversation with Jason mixed with fear of what the future might hold. Returning to the waiting room, he found Martha still on the phone, her voice tinged with desperation as she explained the situation to another contact. Malcolm sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back as they waited for news, good or bad. Malcolm's mind raced with thoughts of what he would do differently when Jason recovered. He silently vowed to be a better father, to listen more, to understand better. But first, Jason had to survive this crisis. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder of the precious time slipping away. Malcolm and Martha clung to each other and to hope, praying for a miracle that would save their son's life as the hours crawled by with no news of a suitable blood donor. Malcolm felt an overwhelming need to do something, anything to help his son. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, pushing him towards action. With a quick word to Martha, who was still tirelessly calling everyone they knew, Malcolm left the hospital, determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to Jason. The drive to the school was a blur, the familiar streets passing unnoticed as his thoughts raced. He pulled into the parking lot, the same spot where he had dropped Jason off that morning. It seemed like a lifetime ago. As Malcolm strode towards the main entrance, his police uniform seemed to part the crowds of students and teachers like a physical force. The hallways, once familiar and benign, now felt hostile and foreign. He made his way directly to the principal's office, barely registering the startled looks from the staff he passed. He knocked briskly on the door before stepping into the principal's office, trying to maintain his professionalism despite his frustration. The man behind the desk glanced up, his face paling at the sight of the furious police officer. "Officer Reed," the principal stammered, "We've been trying to reach you." Malcolm cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "I want to know exactly what happened to my son, and I want to know now." The principal swallowed hard, visibly intimidated by Malcolm's intensity. We're still piecing together the details, but the struggle was far from over. It was only beginning. Malcolm was committed to being there for Jason every step of the way, compensating for the morning's errors with all the love and resolve he could muster. Time moved slowly in the ICU waiting room, each minute stretching endlessly as Malcolm and Martha sat together, hands classively clasped, their gaze fixed on the door to Jason's room. The sterile scent of disinfectant and the continuous beeping of machines loomed over them, underscoring the severity of their situation. Dr. Flores approached with a demeanor of professional calm. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," she began, her voice both soft and assertive, "we are still waiting for the official imaging results, but I want to update you on Jason's condition." Anticipation tensed Malcolm and Martha's bodies as they leaned forward. "Jason's major concern right now is the severe blood loss from the fall," Dr. Flores disclosed. "We've placed him in a coma to stabilize his condition, but he urgently needs a blood transfusion." Martha's grip tightened on Malcolm's hand. "We can donate," she offered immediately. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Dr. Flores responded. "Jason has a type B blood group. We need to find a compatible donor quickly." Malcolm's heart sank. "I might be type A, and Martha is O," he stated, the gravity of the situation dawning on him. Dr. Flores nodded solemnly. "Yes, that excludes both of you as potential donors. We're urgently searching for a match, as the blood not only needs to be compatible, but also from a regular donor to ensure safety for immediate use." The severity of the situation enveloped Malcolm and Martha like a somber shroud. Their ability to help their son was agonizingly limited. "I'll start calling our family and friends right away." "Surely someone can assist," Martha said, determination trembling in her voice. "That's an excellent start," Dr. Flores encouraged. We're also coordinating with the blood bank, but the urgency of finding a match given Jason's specific needs cannot be overstressed." She paused, her tone becoming graver. "It's important to note this does not appear to be an accident. We've noted scratch marks and bruises, along with blackened toenails, signs of physical aggression. Were you aware of this?" Exchanging a serious glance, Malcolm and Martha nodded. "We became aware this morning," Malcolm revealed. "Jason told us he was being bullied by 2 classmates. That corroborates with the physical evidence," Dr. Flores concluded. "These injuries suggest deliberate harm, not just a simple fall." "Thank you, Dr. Flores," Malcolm acknowledged gravely. "I'll inform the police investigation team and follow up with the school for confirmation." After Dr. Flores excused herself to return with updates, Malcolm and Martha shared a look filled with both fear and determination. Martha immediately started contacting their network for a blood donor, while Malcolm, feeling somewhat powerless, stepped outside to clear his head. In the hallway, he ran into 2 colleagues who expressed concern. "How's Jason?" one asked, placing a comforting hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Not well," Malcolm admitted, voice rough with emotion. "He needs a transfusion, but finding a compatible donor is difficult." "We've got some updates about the incident at the school," the other officer said. "Do you want to hear them now, or should we come back later?" Torn between his need for answers and his son's urgent medical needs, Malcolm opted for the latter. "Later," he decided. "Right now, we need to focus on finding a blood donor. Can you help spread the word at the station?" The officers agreed to help and left as Malcolm leaned against the wall, the day's emotional toll weighing heavily on him. Returning to the waiting room, he found Martha still on the phone, her voice desperate as she explained the situation. Sitting beside her, Malcolm placed a comforting hand on her back, waiting for any news, good or bad. Reflecting on what he would change if, when Jason recovered, Malcolm vowed to be a better father, to listen more and understand better. But first, they had to get through this crisis. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder of the precious time slipping away as Malcolm and Martha held on to each other and hope, praying for a miracle to save their son. As the hours dragged on with no news of a suitable blood donor, Malcolm's need to act grew unbearable. With a resolve to support Martha and be there for Jason, he left the hospital, determined to uncover the full truth about the day's events and ensure those responsible faced the consequences. But he resolved to pursue justice the right way, not out of revenge but for transformative change, a future where children like Jason could live without fear, where the color of their skin didn't dictate their treatment. With renewed determination, Malcolm headed towards the police station, feeling more centered despite the emotional roller coaster of the day. As he drove, he clung to hope, thinking of Jason and wishing for positive news once he returned to the hospital. Upon arriving at the police station, Malcolm pushed through the heavy doors, his gaze cutting through the familiar buzz of activity straight to Bradley, who was visibly strained as he sat at a desk. The detective, a middle-aged man with sharp features, stood nearby, poring over a file. "Malcolm," Bradley called out, standing up, his voice steady despite the clear tension in his expression. "I'm really sorry about what happened to your boy. Look, we've got something that might help." Acknowledging him with a brief nod, feeling the heavy weight of the situation, Malcolm responded, "I need to see the footage." Bradley gestured for him to follow, and they moved down a narrow corridor to a dimly lit room where the detective had already set up the CCTV footage from the school. The screen flickered in the low light, showing grainy images of Jason walking with his head down, flanked by Elam and Edric. The boys moved through a school corridor, their forms blurred but unmistakable. Malcolm's eyes were glued to the screen, his heart pounding as he watched the footage, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. Just as he leaned in closer to scrutinize the screen, his phone buzzed. He quickly pulled it from his pocket, his pulse speeding up when he saw Martha's name on the display. Swiping to answer, he said, "Martha," his voice strained, fearing the worst. "Malcolm, we need to talk." Martha's trembling voice came through the phone. "It's about Jason. He's not doing well." Malcolm's attention flickered back to the screen for a split second. The image of Jason walking with the two boys still paused in his mind. He stepped away from the footage, focusing fully on Martha now. "Is he okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "The doctor has an update on Jason's condition." "The test results are out," Martha replied, her voice breaking. "You need to come back to the hospital right away." Malcolm's heart sank. Feeling the panic rising, he glanced at Bradley and the detective, both watching him with concern. "I'm on my way," he stated resolutely. He hung up the phone, meeting Bradley's eyes. "I need to go. I'll be back as soon as I can. Keep me updated on the footage." Bradley nodded solemnly. "We'll keep working on it. Go be with your family." Without needing another word, Malcolm turned and hurried from the room, his steps quick and heavy as he left the station and drove back towards the hospital, his mind filled with dread and hope. As he navigated the familiar streets, the journey felt both endlessly long and shockingly brief, his emotions swinging between hope and dread. Arriving at the hospital, Malcolm found Martha standing outside Jason's room, her face pale and drawn, Dr. Flores beside her with a grave look. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Flores began as Malcolm approached, "we've received the results of Jason's official imaging tests. I'm afraid the news isn't good." Malcolm felt his knees weaken, and he steadied himself against the wall. "What is it?" he managed to whisper. Dr. Flores took a deep breath. "The fall caused significant damage to Jason's liver. The left lobe is severely injured, and we believe a liver transplant is necessary." The news hit Malcolm hard. A transplant. The severity of Jason's condition became starkly clear. "Only half of the liver is needed," Dr. Flores explained, her voice gentle yet firm. "This is a common procedure when only part of the liver is damaged. The donor's liver will regenerate over time." Martha, who had been silent, finally spoke. "But neither of us is a match for Jason's blood type, and I couldn't find anyone willing to donate among our friends or family." "That's the challenge we're facing," Dr. Flores nodded solemnly. "Finding a suitable donor is crucial, and time is of the essence. The requirements are strict. The donor must have the same blood type as Jason, have a history of frequent blood donations, be in good health, and not have eaten recently if this is to be done fast." A wave of despair washed over Malcolm as the odds seemed insurmountable. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice cracking. "We've put Jason on the transplant list," Dr. Flores replied. "But given the urgency of his condition and the specific requirements, it could take some time to find a match. And I'm afraid," she paused, her demeanor softening, "I'm not sure how much time Jason has." The weight of her words settled over Malcolm and Martha like a heavy blanket. Their son's life hung in the balance, dependent on finding a donor who met all these specific criteria. Malcolm pulled Martha close, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. He wanted to offer words of comfort, to tell her everything would be all right. But the reality of their situation was so stark and painful that words failed him as he and Martha clung to each other outside Jason's room. In that heavy silence, Malcolm's mind raced, considering everyone he knew, desperately wondering if any could be a match. He thought bitterly of the irony that his own AB blood type, known as the universal recipient, was useless in this critical moment when his son needed a specific donor. Dr. Flores allowed them a moment of silence before she spoke again. "I know this is overwhelming, but please don't lose hope. We're doing everything we can to find a suitable donor. In the meantime, we'll continue to monitor Jason closely and keep him stable." Malcolm nodded, his words stuck in his throat as Dr. Flores excused herself, promising to return with any updates. He and Martha turned to gaze through the window at their son, lying small and vulnerable amidst life-sustaining machines, oblivious to the desperate search to save his life. In that moment, Malcolm's resolve hardened. He was determined to move heaven and earth to find a donor. He would contact every acquaintance, utilize every resource. His son's life depended on it. With a reassuring squeeze of Martha's hand, Malcolm steeled himself for the battle ahead. The search for a liver donor was just beginning, and he was resolute to see it through, no matter what it took. Over the next few hours, he reached out to everyone he knew, family, friends, colleagues, but finding the right person with the necessary blood type willing to undergo a major surgery proved daunting. Despite the widespread sharing of the request on social media, the search remained frustratingly elusive. Pacing restlessly in the hospital corridor, Malcolm's mind was torn between the need to review more footage at the station for clues and his responsibility to stay with Martha, who needed him now more than ever. Every few steps, he glanced toward the waiting room door, his mind wrestling with his professional duties and his deep desire to support his family. Suddenly, Nurse Mulligan appeared, approaching them with an expression that mixed relief, anxiety, and exhaustion. Martha and Malcolm stood up quickly, their emotions raw as they hoped for news of a donor. "Nurse," Malcolm called out, his voice urgent, barely catching his breath. "Any news? Did they find a donor?" Martha's eyes, brimming with tears, awaited a hopeful answer. Surprisingly, the nurse, not in her usual attire but in a hospital gown, approached with a determined look. "Officer Reed," she said steadily, despite the situation's gravity, "I heard about Jason's condition and what he needs. I want to help. I want to donate part of my liver to your son, if you'll permit it." Malcolm stood dumbfounded, the enormity of her offer momentarily overwhelming him. "But the risks," he began, but Nancy interrupted gently, knowing the stakes. "I understand the risks, Officer Reed, but without this, Jason might not make it. I'm a match, haven't eaten in 6 hours, and I'm a frequent donor. I'm his best chance right now." Martha stepped forward, her voice choked with emotion. "Why would you do this for us?" Nancy's eyes softened, a hint of past sorrow surfacing as she explained. "When I was 10, like Jason, I lost my younger brother because we couldn't get him to a hospital in time. That's why I became a nurse, to ensure no other family suffers like mine did. I have to help. It's my chance to make a difference." Moved to tears, Malcolm struggled to find words. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem enough." "You don't need to say anything," Nancy reassured him with a soft smile. "Just give your permission." "Of course, Nurse Mulligan," Malcolm managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You can call me Nancy," she replied, smiling. At that moment, Dr. Flores approached, her expression serious but hopeful. "We're ready to begin the procedure," she announced. "Nancy, are you certain about this?" Without hesitation, Nancy affirmed, "I am. Let's do this." As the medical team prepared Nancy for surgery and continued their care for Jason, Malcolm and Martha held each other close, overwhelmed by her sacrifice. "I'll see you on the other side," Nancy said bravely as she was wheeled into the operating room. Watching her go, Malcolm turned to Martha, seeing his own mix of fear and hope mirrored in her eyes. "She's risking her life for our son," he whispered. "It's a miracle, Malcolm," Martha responded, tears streaming down her face. "A real miracle." As they settled in to wait, Malcolm felt a profound shift in perspective. The world wasn't just filled with hostility. It also held individuals like Nancy, willing to make incredible sacrifices. This reminder that goodness and hope were still possible comforted them as they awaited the outcome of the surgery. Yet, filled with concern, Martha asked, "Will you come with me? It's only 3 p.m. The school's still open. Maybe we can visit the playground to see for ourselves where everything happened. What do you think?" Malcolm looked at her, his mind still reeling from the chaos of the last few hours, but he saw determination in her eyes and nodded. "Yeah, let's go. We need answers. I didn't visit the playground earlier. I wasn't ready. But with you here, I think I can do it." They made their way to the nurse's station to inform them of their departure. The nurse, busy with charts, glanced up, her expression calm. "The surgery will take another 3 hours," she informed them, her voice steady. "We'll keep you updated if anything changes. Just let us know if you need anything." Malcolm and Martha exchanged a quick glance before Malcolm nodded in acknowledgement. "We'll be back soon." "Thank you." With that, they left the hospital and stepped into the bright afternoon light. The tension between them was palpable as they drove. Neither knew exactly what they would find at the school, but both felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing on their minds. The streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The quiet between them was filled with unspoken thoughts, fears for Jason's recovery, and worries about the truth behind the bullying. Upon reaching the school, Malcolm stood at the entrance, his mind still spinning from the ongoing surgery. He checked his phone repeatedly while walking down the corridor. As he neared the doors, he spotted the principal stepping out of his office. The man's face drained of color when he saw Malcolm approaching. "Officer Reed," the principal stammered, his voice nervous. I didn't expect to see you back so soon. How is Jason?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "He's in recovery, no thanks to this school's lack of action," he retorted, causing the principal to flinch. "Officer Reed, I assure you, we take bullying very seriously. Perhaps we could discuss this further in my office." Malcolm shook his head. "No, I'm not here to talk about this again. My wife and I want to see the playground where it happened, and I need to speak with the teacher who made the report." The principal hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course. Mr. Doe was the teacher who found Jason. He teaches in the secondary school building, which is under a different administration, and the old playground where he found Jason is also in that building. This elementary building connects through a narrow lane, but I can take you to the playground and fetch him for you." As they walked towards the abandoned playground, the principal called over Jason's homeroom teacher, Miss Catherine. He asked her to accompany them while he went to find Mr. Doe. Miss Catherine led them through a narrow passage, explaining that this section that connects the elementary and the secondary school buildings should be limited to students. They reached the playground, which was cordoned off with police tape, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Malcolm stood at the edge of the tape, his eyes scanning the area, trying to piece together what had happened to his son. The playground looked as if it had been abandoned for a long time. Miss Catherine broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Officer Reed, there's something you should know. I was aware that Elam and Edric have targeted Jason." Malcolm turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Miss Catherine glanced nervously in the direction the principal had gone before continuing. "They've been bullying Jason for months, forcing him to do their homework, stealing his lunch, cornering him in the hallways. I've reported it multiple times and tried to separate them." Malcolm felt a surge of anger. But Elle and Edric's parents are major donors to the school," Miss Catherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The administration has been hesitant to take strong action against them." Before Malcolm could respond, Mr. Doe arrived with the principal, slightly out of breath. "Officer Reed," he said, extending his hand, "I'm so sorry about what happened to Jason. How is he doing?" Malcolm shook the PE teacher's hand, his mind still grappling with Miss Catherine's revelation. "He's in surgery right now," Malcolm explained, his voice tight. "There's liver damage from the fall and a concussion. Thankfully, we found someone who was kind enough to volunteer as a donor." Miss Catherine's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Oh my God, I had no idea it was that serious." Mr. Doe looked surprised, even in his silence. Martha nodded, her attention now fully focused on the PE teacher. Mr. Doe, can you tell me and my husband exactly what you saw? Mr. Doe nodded solemnly. I can't stop thinking about it. If only I had gotten here sooner, he began, his face pale with the memory. I was passing by this area to grab some equipment from the PE storage room nearby. At first, I saw Jason on top of the bench over there. He pointed to a set of concrete steps leading up to a raised platform. He seemed to be performing or dancing, but then suddenly he was struggling against two other boys, Elam and Edric. Malcolm asked, though he already knew the answer. Mr. Doe nodded. I believe so, yes. It all happened so fast. I shouted at them from where I was, asking them why they are here and not in class, but before I could get there, they pushed Jason. He rolled down the steps and hit that rock at the bottom. He pointed to a large jagged stone at the base of the steps. Malcolm felt sick as he imagined the scene. What happened next? The two boys ran off, shouting something about Jason being a coward. Mr. Debble continued. I rushed over to Jason. He was conscious at first, saying, "Help, Dad, and sorry." I didn't realize how badly he was hurt at first. There wasn't much visible blood, and he was trying to get up. So, what did you do? Malcolm pressed, his voice tight with emotion. I went to get the first aid kit from the infirmary, Mr. Doe admitted, his voice filled with regret. When I came back, Jason had lost consciousness, and there was so much blood. That's when I called emergency services. Malcolm nodded, taking in the information. He turned to Miss Catherine. And you say this bullying has been going on for months? Miss Catherine nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I've tried to intervene, to report it. But she glanced towards the school building, noticing how the administration always seemed to make excuses for not taking serious action. Malcolm clenched his fists at his side. Just then, the principal spoke up, his voice nervous. Officer Reed, perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office and find a way to handle this internally, as I offered, considering the school's reputation. Malcolm turned to the principal, his voice low and dangerous. I've already told you, I am not interested in handling this internally. This ceased being an internal matter the moment my son was assaulted on your watch. And you're worried about your reputation? My son almost died because of what happened here. The principal's face grew paler, realizing the gravity of his misstep. I didn't mean that, of course. Jason's well-being is our primary concern, but surely we can resolve this situation without involving the media or taking legal action, the principal suggested hesitantly. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low and controlled but filled with intensity. Let me make this very clear. My son has internal bleeding, his liver was damaged, and he needed a transplant. He could have died at any moment, and you're suggesting we settle this quietly? No. The principal, Mr. Doe, and Miss Catherine all stood in shocked silence. Malcolm continued, his gaze sweeping over them. This isn't about protecting reputations anymore. This is about justice and ensuring no other child has to endure what Jason did. Mr. Doe stepped forward, his face set with determination. Officer Reed, I want you to know that I'm willing to testify about what I saw, regardless of the consequences. Miss Catherine nodded in agreement. Me too. I'll testify about Elam and Edric's behavior and the school's lack of action. It's time someone stood up to this. The principal looked from Mr. Doe to Miss Catherine and back to Malcolm, realizing he was quickly losing control of the situation. Officer Reed, please think about what this could do to the school, to the community. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. What this could do to the school? What about what it's already done to my son, to other kids who've been bullied. No, it's time for change, and if that means shaking things up, then so be it. He turned to the principal, his voice carrying a note of finality. If you want to save any shred of this school's reputation, you'd better start cooperating fully with the investigation. Money and influence can only protect those boys so far. The law is on our side, and I intend to see justice done. The principal opened his mouth to protest further, but Malcolm cut him off. That's something for you to think about. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back. As Malcolm prepared to leave, Martha's phone rang, and they both tensed, recognizing the hospital's number. Martha stepped aside to answer it. Malcolm looked around the playground area, imagining the events of that day, now eager to contact Bradley for any update regarding the CCTV footage. Malcolm, Martha's voice came, filled with excitement. The surgery is going to be concluded in 1 hour. We need to come back to the hospital right away and be ready. Tell them we'll be there in 10 minutes, Malcolm replied, his heart leaping in his chest. Let's go, he said, already striding toward the corridor. As Malcolm walked away, he could hear the principal's panicked whispers to Mr. Doe and Miss Catherine, but he paid them no mind. His focus was now entirely on getting back to the hospital, back to Jason. He and Martha climbed into the patrol car, his mind racing with everything he had learned, the school's negligence, the ongoing bullying, the attempt to cover it all up. It was worse than he had imagined, but now, with Mr. Doe and Miss Catherine willing to testify, there was a real chance for justice. As he sped towards the hospital, Malcolm's mind raced with the truth about what had happened to Jason finally coming to light, and now there was hope for his recovery. Yet, he knew the fight was far from over. There would be a long road ahead. Jason's recovery, the legal battle against Elam and Edric and their families, and the push for real change at the school. But for now, all that mattered was getting to the hospital. His son needed him, and this time he would be there for him. The hospital came into view, and Malcolm felt a surge of anticipation. He was ready to face whatever came next. As he parked his car and they hurried towards the hospital entrance, Malcolm made a silent vow. He would be the father Jason needed, not just a protector, but a listener, a supporter, someone Jason could trust with his fears and struggles. The mistakes of the past couldn't be undone, but he could make things right going forward. Yet, with concern permeating the air, Martha suggested, "Should we visit the school? It's only 3 p.m. Perhaps we could see the playground where it all happened. What do you think?" Malcolm, still reeling from the day's events, saw the resolve in her eyes and nodded in agreement. "Yes, let's go. We need answers. I haven't been to the playground yet. I wasn't ready earlier, but with you, I think I can manage." They informed the nurse at the station of their temporary departure. She, busy with her charts, looked up and reassured them calmly, "The surgery will still take about 3 hours. We'll update you if there's any change. Just let us know if you need anything else." Acknowledging her with a nod, Malcolm responded, "We'll be back soon." "Thank you." They then left the hospital, stepping into the bright afternoon light. As they drove, the weight of their unanswered questions seemed to make the minutes stretch on endlessly, filling the car with a tense silence, only broken by their quiet concerns for Jason's recovery and the troubling details of the bullying. Arriving at the school, Malcolm paused at the entrance, his mind still on the surgery. Checking his phone for updates, he approached the school doors, where he immediately spotted the principal exiting his office. The principal, pale upon seeing Malcolm, stuttered, "Officer Reed, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. How is Jason?" Tightening his jaw, Malcolm sharply replied, "He's in surgery, recovering from injuries that shouldn't have happened if this school had acted. And you're worried about the school's reputation." The principal flinched, realizing his mistake. Of course, we care about Jason's well-being. But perhaps we could resolve this without attracting media attention or legal actions. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice stern and filled with intensity. Let me be clear. My son suffered internal bleeding, needed a transplant, and was at death's door. And you suggest we handle this quietly? No way. The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation settling among them. Malcolm continued, We're beyond protecting reputations now. This is about justice and ensuring no child suffers like Jason did. Mr. Doe interjected, I'm prepared to testify about what I witnessed, no matter the consequences. Miss Catherine agreed. I will also testify. It's time someone took a stand against this. The principal glanced nervously among them, realizing his position was weakening. Please consider the implications for the school and community, he pleaded. Malcolm countered, What about the implications for my son and others who've been bullied? It's time for change. If that means shaking things up, then it's necessary. His words left a definitive note in the air, signaling his refusal to back down. As they prepared to leave, Martha received a call from the hospital. She stepped aside to answer, her voice returning with relief. The surgery is ending soon. We need to return to the hospital right away. Tell them we'll be there in 10 minutes, Malcolm replied, urgency in his step as he headed back to the car, leaving the principal's attempts to mollify him unheeded. In the car, Malcolm and Martha drove in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the school's failures, the ongoing bullying, and the forthcoming challenges. But now, with potential testimonies from Mr. Doe and Miss Catherine, there was a real chance for justice. They arrived at the hospital filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Malcolm's mind was clear. They would fight for Jason's justice and push for necessary changes at the school. As they walked through the hospital doors, Malcolm silently reaffirmed his commitment to being the father Jason needed, supportive, attentive, and protective. Whatever lay ahead, they were prepared to face it together, stronger and more united than ever. However, the nurse who had checked in earlier had reported that Jason's vitals were stable. Malcolm nodded and stood up, stretching. I'm going to grab some coffee from the cafeteria. Do you need anything else? Before Martha could respond, a slight movement from Jason's hand caught their eye. It twitched slightly. Jason! Martha called out, her voice trembling with hope. Honey, can you hear us? Slowly, Jason's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the room's soft light. His gaze, initially unfocused, eventually settled on his parents' faces. Mom! Dad, he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and the recently removed breathing tube. In an instant, Malcolm and Martha were by his side, tears streaming down their faces. We're here, son, Malcolm managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. You're safe now. You're going to be okay. A nurse, alerted by the change in Jason's vitals, entered the room. After a brief check, she smiled at the family. This is a good sign. I'll let Dr. Flores know he's awake. As she left the room, Jason's grip on their hands tightened. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Oh, honey, you have nothing to be sorry for, Martha soothed him gently, stroking his hair. Malcolm, feeling a lump forming in his throat, added, No, Jason, I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't listen to you. I didn't realize how bad things were at school, but I promise, things are going to be different now. Jason, his eyes still heavy with fatigue, looked at his father, puzzled. Different how? He asked weakly. Malcolm took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I promise I'll listen more, son. I won't push you to be something you're not. And we're going to make sure those boys who hurt you face consequences for what they did. Jason's brow furrowed slightly. Elam and Edric, what's going to happen to them? Before Malcolm could respond, Dr. Flores entered the room, her face brightening when she saw Jason awake. "Well, look who's decided to join us," she exclaimed warmly. "How are you feeling, Jason?" As Dr. Flores began her examination, Malcolm and Martha stepped back to give her room to work. After assessing Jason, Dr. Flores turned to them with a smile. "He's doing remarkably well, all things considered. The transplant is taking, and his body is responding positively. We'll need to keep him here for a while longer for observation, but I'm optimistic about his recovery." Relieved, Malcolm and Martha thanked Dr. Flores profusely as she left to check on her other patients. As they settled back at Jason's bedside, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Jason, what happened to you wasn't your fault. Those boys, Elam and Edric, they did a terrible thing, and they're going to face consequences for it," he reassured his son, who looked slightly relieved. "Are they going to jail?" Jason asked. "No, son, they're too young for that, but they will be held accountable. We're going to make sure they're expelled from school, and their families will cover the cost of your medical treatment," Martha added softly, "and we're going to make sure the school changes its policies so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Jason nodded slowly, processing this. "Dad, do you remember when you told me I needed to be brave and stand up for myself?" Malcolm felt a pang of guilt. "Yes, son, I remember." "I tried," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. "When they cornered me on the playground, I tried to use those self-defense moves you taught me, but there were two of them, and they were bigger." Tears stung Malcolm's eyes as he gently squeezed Jason's hand. "You were brave, Jason, so brave. I'm sorry I put that pressure on you. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. From now on, if anyone tries to hurt you, I want you to tell us or a teacher right away. You don't have to face these things alone." Jason's eyes filled with tears, but there was also relief. "Really? You won't be disappointed if I don't fight back?" "Never," Malcolm said firmly. "Your safety and happiness are what matter most. I'm so proud of you, son, not because you tried to fight back, but because you're kind and smart and strong in ways that have nothing to do with fighting." Martha leaned in, kissing Jason's forehead. "We love you so much, sweetheart, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As Jason drifted back to sleep, exhausted from the conversation, Malcolm and Martha exchanged a look of determination. They knew the road ahead would be challenging. Jason's recovery, the legal battles, the push for change at the school, but they were ready to face it together as a family.